The WNBA just watched their entire league collapse in real time, and they only have themselves to blame. What you're about to hear isn't a sports story. It's a financial disaster, an institutional betrayal, and a slow-motion collapse that the people in charge saw coming and did absolutely nothing to stop. Stay until the end because the final numbers are going to make you furious. If you're new here and you want the real story behind what's happening in women's basketball, not the PR version, not the sugar-coated version, hit subscribe right now. We cover what other channels won't touch. Picture this. One player goes down with an injury and an entire professional sports league loses more than half its television audience overnight. Not some of it, more than half. Ticket prices crater by 70%. Arenas that were sold out weeks in advance suddenly can't give away seats. Sponsors start making phone calls they never expected to make this early in the season. This is not a hypothetical. This is not a thought experiment designed to make a dramatic point. This is the WNBA in 2025. And the numbers are so staggering, so brutally specific that even the league's most devoted defenders are struggling to explain them away. The uncomfortable truth in professional sports right now is sitting in plain sight. It's written in collapsing ratings, nosediving revenue figures, and a league office that seems almost determined to look the other way. Caitlin Clark is not just the WNBA's best player. She is by every measurable standard available the entire economic engine of a league that existed in near total obscurity before she arrived. And right now she is sidelined again. The league that should have done everything in its power to keep her healthy and protected is the same league that created the exact conditions that put her on the bench in the first place. What we are watching is not just a sports story. It is a masterclass in institutional self-destruction. And it is happening in real time. When Clark first went down with a left quad strain, the sports world took notice. It wasn't just Indiana Fever fans who were alarmed. Analysts, casual viewers, sponsors, and broadcast partners all felt the same jolt of concern because everyone who had been paying attention already knew what her absence would mean for the league's bottom line. But what happened next was somehow even worse than the initial injury itself. The quad strain didn't heal in isolation. It led directly to a groin injury. And anyone with even a basic understanding of sports medicine could have seen that coming. When an athlete compensates for one injury by subconsciously adjusting their movement patterns, the surrounding muscles and joints absorb stress they were never designed to handle. The body tries to protect the damaged area, and in doing so it overloads something else. It's one of the most common and most frustrating injury cycles in all of professional sports, and it was playing out in front of everyone paying attention. What made this particularly alarming wasn't just the groin injury itself. It was the timing, the pattern, and the question hanging in the air that nobody in the league's front office seemed willing to answer directly. Caitlin Clark had barely missed a game since her college days. She was known for her durability as much as her brilliance. And now, within the span of a few weeks, she was dealing with her second significant injury of the season. The most logical explanation, the one that sports analysts and commentators were increasingly willing to say out loud, was that the relentless physical punishment she had been absorbing all season long was finally taking its toll. There was also the matter of her performances in the games immediately before the injury was officially announced. In the 3 games preceding her being sidelined, Clark had shot at a level that nobody who had watched her play had ever seen before, numbers that were completely inconsistent with everything she had shown throughout her career. The kind of shooting slump that in retrospect looked far less like a cold streak and far more like an athlete playing through pain she hadn't yet disclosed publicly. The body gives signals before it gives out completely. And those signals in hindsight were impossible to miss. The concern going forward was not just about this specific injury. It was about what rush decisions could mean for her long-term health. If the Fever or the league created any pressure to get her back on the court before she was genuinely ready, the risk was not another missed game or two. The risk was a serious structural injury that could sideline her for months or longer. The kind of injury that changes a career trajectory permanently. And given everything that had already happened, given the way she had been targeted and physically worn down all season, the idea that anyone might prioritize short-term gate receipts over her long-term well-being was enough to make any reasonable person genuinely furious. Now, let's talk about the numbers because this is where the story stops being debatable. There is a certain kind of sports debate that can go on forever because both sides have enough anecdotal evidence to keep trading points indefinitely. The argument about Caitlin Clark's importance to the WNBA is not that kind of debate. It ended the moment the viewership data came in after her first injury absence. And nothing that has happened since has done anything except make those numbers look more damning with every passing week. When Clark was active and playing, nationally televised WNBA games were averaging 1.81 million viewers. That figure represented something the league had never come close to achieving before her arrival. It was the result of genuine widespread public interest in women's basketball, driven almost entirely by one player's extraordinary ability to draw audiences who had never previously given the sport a second thought. Networks were happy. Advertisers were happy. The league's leadership was publicly celebrating a new era for women's basketball. Then Clark went down. The average viewership for nationally televised games dropped to 847,000. That is a 55% collapse. Not a dip, not a slight softening of numbers. More than half the audience was gone the moment she was no longer on the court. And here is where it gets even harder to look away. The league's average viewership without Clark settled at around 555,000 viewers. The prior year's full season average, before Clark had ever played a single professional game, was 670,000. Read that again slowly. The WNBA without Caitlin Clark is now drawing fewer viewers than it did before she existed in the league. All the growth, every percentage point of progress, every new sponsor, every broadcast deal, every cultural moment, every celebration from league officials about a new era for women's sports. All of it evaporates the second she is not available. The ticket market told the same story with equal brutality. The average price for a Clark game had reached $1,370 at its peak, reflecting genuine demand from fans who were willing to pay premium prices just to watch her play live. When she was ruled out, those same tickets dropped to an average of $80. That is not a modest market correction. That is the market sending an unmistakable message about who people were actually paying to see. Fever game tickets fell by 71%. Individual seats dropped from $860 down to $250 in some cases. One specific game that had been anticipated as a marquee matchup specifically because Clark was expected to play saw tickets fall from $210 to $95 once her absence was confirmed. Some of those games had already been moved to larger venues to accommodate the crowds her presence was expected to generate. Arenas upgraded specifically for her. Now struggling to fill seats at a fraction of the original ticket price. That logistical and financial embarrassment alone should have been enough to prompt some serious internal reflection from league leadership. It wasn't. And then there was the corporate money. Sponsors had committed significant dollars to the WNBA specifically because of what Clark had done to the league's visibility and cultural footprint. Those deals were structured around an assumption of continued growth, continued rating strength, and continued relevance in the broader sports conversation. Her injury didn't just hurt ticket sales and television numbers. It put a question mark next to every single one of those sponsorship agreements and forced partners to ask whether the investment still made sense when the one variable that justified the premium was sitting on the bench in street clothes. Now, here is a statistic that should stop you cold. By the league's own economic analysis, Caitlin Clark is responsible for generating 26.5% of all WNBA economic activity. Not 26.5% of Indiana Fever revenue, not 26.5% of television ratings, 26.5% of the entire league's economic ecosystem produced by one player on one roster in a league with 12 teams. In a league where economic activity is theoretically spread across dozens of players, coaches, markets, and franchises, more than a quarter of everything traces back to a single human being. Her presence drives ticket sales not just for the Fever, but for road games across the league because opposing teams were selling out venues specifically because she was coming to town. Her presence drives television ratings for every network broadcast. Her presence drives merchandise, sponsorship interest, media coverage, social media engagement, and the kind of casual fan attention that professional leagues spend millions of dollars trying to manufacture and usually fail to. And despite all of that, the league was projecting a $50 million loss for the season. Even with Clark playing, even with all that economic activity she was generating, even with historic viewership numbers and sold-out arenas and record merchandise sales, the WNBA was still going to lose $50 million. With her out indefinitely, those losses were not just growing, they were accelerating. Because every week she was out representing another wave of evaporated revenue the league had no mechanism to replace. But here is what nobody in the league office was willing to say publicly. The CBA negotiations looming at the end of the season made all of this urgently immediately consequential for every player in the league. The collective bargaining agreement would determine player salaries across the entire organization for the foreseeable future. Every player had a direct financial stake in the league, demonstrating strong sustainable economic health heading into those negotiations. The stronger the numbers, the stronger the player's bargaining position. The weaker the numbers, the easier it would be for league ownership to justify keeping salaries suppressed. Clark's injury wasn't just costing the league money in the present. It was potentially costing every WNBA player money in their next contract, and the league seemed either unable or unwilling to fully reckon with that. This is the point where we have to talk about something that a lot of people in sports media have been dancing around. The conversation about Clark's injuries cannot be separated from the conversation about how she's been treated physically on the court all season. These are not two different stories. They are the same story. And the through line connecting them is a pattern of hard fouls, late hits, and physical intimidation that the league has consistently declined to address with anything approaching meaningful consequences. The data on this is specific enough to be genuinely alarming. One team alone was responsible for 80% of the league's most egregious fouls on Clark, with multiple incidents occurring in 2026 alone. These were not competitive basketball plays in any normal sense of the phrase. They were the kind of contact that draws gasps from crowds, that prompts immediate reaction from teammates and coaches, and that in any other professional sports context would result in swift and significant disciplinary action. In the WNBA, they were met with what had become a familiar institutional response, a shrug, a reference to competitive physicality being part of the game, and a quiet implication that anyone expressing concern about it was somehow misunderstanding the nature of professional basketball. Clark was put in an impossible position by the league's refusal to intervene when she reacted to the physical targeting when she showed frustration or pushed back on the court. She was criticized for being too confrontational, for not handling the pressure with the composure expected of a star player. When she absorbed the contact without visible reaction, she was described as needing to toughen up and accept the physicality as a normal part of the game. There was no response available to her that the league or its most vocal critics would have accepted as appropriate. The game was rigged against her before she even stepped on the court. And the cumulative physical toll of playing through that environment all season was now manifesting in the injury report. One of the most respected voices in American sports journalism was among the most direct in naming what was happening. The assessment was blunt. The WNBA was continuously failing to meet the moment. At the exact point in time when more people were watching women's basketball than ever before in the sport's history, what those new viewers were seeing was a league that allowed its most compelling player to be targeted with impunity. It was not just a competitive problem. It was an existential credibility problem. The comparison to other leagues makes the WNBA's position look even more indefensible. Imagine the NBA allowing opposing players to target its biggest star with the kind of deliberate physical aggression Clark had been absorbing for months. The suspension would arrive before the press conference ended. The message from the league would be immediate, clear, and non-negotiable. You do not target the sport's most valuable promotional asset. Full stop. The standard exists not just because of competitive fairness. It exists because professional leagues understand that protecting their marquee talent is protecting the financial health of the entire enterprise. The WNBA either didn't understand that principle or chose not to apply it. And the injury report and the viewership numbers and the ticket prices are the direct consequence of that choice. To understand why the league responded the way it did, it's worth going back to the beginning. When Clark first arrived in the WNBA, she was almost deliberately humble. She went out of her way to credit her teammates, to deflect attention from herself, to position her success as a collective achievement rather than a solo performance. She was 22 years old, coming off one of the most decorated college careers in the history of the sport. And she handled the transition to professional basketball with a maturity and self-awareness that was genuinely remarkable. The league had an extraordinary opportunity at that moment. Here was a player who had already demonstrated a unique ability to draw audiences to women's basketball. Here was someone who came in without an ego agenda, who wasn't demanding special treatment, who was doing everything right in terms of how she carried herself as a professional. The path forward was obvious. Embrace her. Protect her. Build the league's growth around her popularity while using that attention to elevate the rest of the players and the sport as a whole. Use this moment as a foundation rather than treating it as a threat. Instead, what happened was something uglier and considerably more short-sighted. Internal politics created a climate where Clark's success was resented rather than celebrated by significant portions of the league's existing community. Veterans who had spent years in near total obscurity playing excellent basketball for tiny audiences and even smaller paychecks suddenly found themselves overshadowed by a rookie who was generating more attention in her first month than some of them had seen in their entire careers. The emotional logic of that resentment was understandable on a human level. The way it manifested on the court and in the broader league culture was something else entirely. Rather than addressing the dynamic directly and making clear that Clark's popularity was an asset for every player in the league, the WNBA allowed the tension to fester. They allowed the targeting on the court to continue without consequences. They presented the whole situation as a complex, nuanced matter of competitive balance and player expression when it was actually something much simpler. A league failing to protect the one player who was generating enough public interest to change its financial future. The irony was almost painful. The players who resented Clark's spotlight were the same players who stood to benefit most from the financial growth she was driving. Every sold-out arena, every record television rating, every new sponsorship deal that came in on the back of her popularity was money that would eventually flow back into the league's economy and into the collective bargaining position of every player in the organization by targeting her, by creating the conditions that contributed to her injuries. They were, in a very literal sense, targeting their own paychecks. One of the most significant and least discussed developments in this entire story was the emergence of a deliberate fan boycott of WNBA games that didn't feature Clark. This wasn't passive disengagement. It wasn't casual fans simply losing interest when their favorite player was unavailable. It was an active, conscious decision by a substantial portion of the audience to withhold viewership as a form of protest. The viewers who were staying away weren't just people who liked watching Clark play basketball. Many of them were people who had become invested in the larger narrative around her, who had followed the story of how she'd been treated, who had seen the fouls and the lack of consequences and the league's defensive non-responses, and who had made a deliberate decision that continuing to watch WNBA games without her was functionally an endorsement of everything they found objectionable about how the situation had been handled. They weren't going to hand the league viewership numbers it didn't deserve. This distinction matters enormously for how the WNBA should be thinking about its current crisis. A viewership drop caused by simple fan preference for one player is a problem, but it's a manageable one. It can be addressed over time by developing other compelling players and storylines and gradually broadening the league's appeal. A viewership drop caused by an active boycott from fans who feel the league has behaved badly and want to send a message is a fundamentally different and far more dangerous situation. You cannot develop your way out of a credibility problem. You cannot market your way past an audience that has made a deliberate moral choice to tune out. And here is the cruel twist that nobody was talking about loudly enough. The boycott was directly tied to the CBA situation in ways that league officials seemed not to fully appreciate. Every game without Clark that drew boycott-level viewership numbers was another data point that ownership could point to during negotiations to argue that player salaries shouldn't increase dramatically because the league's financial health was too uncertain. The fans boycotting in protest of how Clark had been treated were inadvertently providing ammunition for ownership to suppress the salaries of every player in the league, including the ones the boycott was ostensibly targeting. It was a situation with no good outcomes for anyone, created entirely by the league's failure to handle one player's emergence with anything resembling strategic intelligence. The WNBA's handling of this situation becomes even more difficult to defend when you place it alongside how other major professional sports leagues managed comparable moments in their history. Michael Jordan's relationship with the NBA during his peak years was perhaps the most instructive comparison. Jordan's presence moved ratings and attendance in ways that were unprecedented for the sport. When he retired the first time, NBA viewership took a meaningful hit. But the league had spent the Jordan years building a global brand, developing other compelling players and markets, and establishing the NBA as a worldwide entertainment property rather than just a basketball league. The Jordan era was the foundation, not the whole building. The WNBA treated the Clark era as an inconvenience to be managed rather than an opportunity to be maximized. The NBA comparison is especially pointed when it comes to player protection. The NBA has a long and well-documented history of intervening aggressively when star players are targeted with dirty play. The suspensions are swift. The fines are significant. The message from the league is consistent and unambiguous. We protect our marquee talent because our marquee talent is the product we're selling. The WNBA's approach was the opposite of that in almost every specific detail. And the let-them-play philosophy that WNBA officials kept falling back on was not a principled stance on competitive basketball. It was a rhetorical dodge that allowed the league to avoid taking responsibility for a pattern of behavior that was costing it millions of dollars and pushing its most valuable player toward the injury that everyone paying attention had been warning about for months. Professional leagues protect their stars not because stars are more important as human beings than other players, but because protecting the product is fundamental to running a sustainable business. That is not a controversial position in any other sports context. Only here did it somehow become a matter of ongoing debate. The financial picture heading into the back half of the season was not one that league officials could look at with any real optimism. The projected $50 million loss had been calculated assuming Clark would be active and generating her normal economic impact. With her out indefinitely, those losses were expanding in real time. Broadcast partners who had paid for rights with certain viewership expectations built into their calculations were watching those expectations collapse in the ratings data. Sponsors who had made commitments based on the league's momentum were having conversations that no one in league leadership wanted to be part of. What made the situation structurally fragile in a way that went beyond this single season was the nature of the dependence itself. The WNBA hadn't used the years of sold-out arenas and record television ratings to establish the league's brand identity in ways that could survive a single player's absence. They hadn't built the kind of deep and loyal fan base that continues to show up even when the marquee attraction isn't available. Instead, almost the entire audience was sitting on one player. And now that player was sitting on the bench. The cycle this created was predictable enough that multiple analysts had been warning about it publicly for the better part of a year. Clark plays, numbers go up. Clark is out, numbers collapse. Clark returns, numbers recover. Clark goes down again, numbers crater. The league oscillates between boom and bust based entirely on one person's availability. And because nothing structural is being done to address the underlying dependence, each cycle is potentially more damaging than the last. The audience that keeps getting pulled in and then disappointed eventually stops coming back. Casual fans have limited patience for a product that only delivers when one specific condition is met. The window for converting Clark's popularity into durable lead growth was not going to stay open indefinitely. The most damning aspect of all of it was the preventability, not the injury itself. Injuries happen in professional sports. No organization can guarantee their best player stays healthy. What was preventable was the environment that contributed to those injuries, the physical targeting, the lack of protective officiating, the culture of resentment that the league allowed to develop rather than addressing Hedon, the accumulation of hard fouls and late hits that a player can only absorb for so long before the wear and tear becomes something structural. All of that was within the league's control. All of that could have been different. And all of that adds up to a situation where the WNBA isn't dealing with bad luck. It's dealing with the consequences of its own choices made repeatedly and consistently over the course of an entire season. The WNBA now faces a reckoning it has been avoiding since the moment Clark stepped onto a professional court. The question is not complicated, even if the answer is uncomfortable. What kind of league do they want to be? If the answer is a professional basketball organization that competes for mainstream audiences, that attracts serious sponsorship money, that offers its players a genuinely competitive salary structure, and that builds on the momentum of this historic moment in women's sports, then the path forward requires making choices the league has so far been unwilling to make. Consistent and forcible player safety standards. Meaningful consequences for deliberate physical targeting. A clear institutional message that the league's relationship with its star players is protective rather than adversarial. A willingness to prioritize long-term sustainability over short-term political appeasement within the league's existing culture. If the answer is a league that continues to prioritize internal politics over competitive integrity, that treats its most valuable economic asset as a problem to be managed rather than a gift to be cultivated, then the path forward leads exactly where the numbers suggest it's already heading. Back to 555,000 average viewers, back to empty arenas and stagnant sponsorship interest, and players making salaries that don't reflect the quality of basketball being played. Back to the era before Clark existed in this league, which wasn't so long ago that anyone should have forgotten how bleak it looked. The cruelest part of the whole situation is that Clark herself did everything right. She came in humble. She worked harder than anyone had reason to expect from someone who had already achieved everything she achieved in college. She handled the targeting, the criticism, and the physical punishment with a toughness and professionalism that most veterans twice her age would struggle to match. She generated hundreds of millions of dollars in economic value for a league that thanked her by allowing her to be knocked around until her body broke down. And now she's on the bench. And the league is staring at viewership numbers that look like a verdict. The WNBA had something extraordinary. A player who could transform their sport the way once-in-a-generation talents always do. A genuine cultural moment in women's basketball loaded with public goodwill and commercial opportunity and the attention of audiences who had never previously given the sport a serious look. The opportunity to use all of that to build something lasting, something meaningful, something financially sustainable. All they had to do was not destroy it. And they couldn't manage that. Whether they learn from it before it's too late is the only question that matters now. And based on everything they have shown so far, the honest answer is that nobody should be counting on.